So, too, did the possibility of a different kind of fidelity, the fidelity of remembering. The scriptorium's door shut behind them, and the ledger's small light was folded into pockets and psalms. What would follow if purge or pardon, if violence or mercy lay beyond their hands? Matthias went home, and in the dark corridor his mother pressed her forehead against the door and said nothing. He wrapped the small folio against his chest until the fabric warmed. At the window his reflection stared back at him, a man with inked fingers and a face that had begun to carry the map of worry. He climbed into bed with the ledger like contraband beneath his pillow, and, for the first time in his life, dreamed not of neat rows of letters, but of names walking up from the ground and shaking the hands of those who had pretended they did not belong to anyone. When dawn came, it brought with it the ordinary bustle of the capital, vendors setting out their wares, a priest crossing himself before opening a shop shutter, a carriage that expelled a bloom of dust. The Chronicle sat on its shelf in the scriptorium, heavy with state certainty. In its margins now lay the quiet defiance of a few narrowed strokes. No one had yet noticed. But marginalia, like seeds, wait for the right season to take root. Matthias understood that they had not solved anything. They had only shifted the terms. The ledger was no longer a solitary danger. It was a shared burden. He felt the weight of it as a sort of promise. The work of conscience, he realized, would not end with the writing. It would require tending, and tend they must. He stepped into the day with ink still under his nails, and the city hummed as if nothing had changed. That, he knew, was the deceptive thing. Silence is loudest just before it breaks. Matthias had known graves by the ledger for weeks. He had read dates and names in the quiet of the scriptorium, his spectacles sliding down his nose as the columns of ink converged and receded. But a name on paper was a thing tempered by the hand that wrote it, precise, obedient to margins, subject to the economy of omission. The ledger had been ordered, tidy even in its crimes. It had the bureaucrat's calm that made betrayal seem like an accounting decision. That was the shape guilt took on his desk, neat, routinized, able to be hidden beneath other pages. Seeing a mound was another language entirely. They reached the burial ground by a path that sloped away from the city in a fold of land the new capital had overlooked when it rebuilt itself like a man in a hurry to dress. The path was shaded by yew and hawthorn. Nettles flamed along the edges where no foot had gone for a season. Rain had fallen earlier, and the air smelled of turned earth and late leaf mold. Matthias kept his hands in his coat pockets, though he had reason to touch many things. The ledger was wrapped under his cloak with the care of contraband, a heavy plane against his ribs. Ryan moved with the short, economical stride of a man who had learned to measure distance in paces and consequence. He held no lamp, only a small spade at his side. The graves lay in a hollow like a forgotten sentence. There were no statues, no orderly lines. Mounds rose and sagged, the grass on them darker where boots had pressed. Here and there a cracked wooden marker thrust from the soil, moss softening the names that had once been carved into their faces. Some markers were nothing but a length of plaited willow stuck at the head like a comma. It was not the grand burial of a deed, but the quiet work of someone who wanted the dead kept but not advertised. Ryan stopped short and removed his cloak. "We leave the torches in the town," he said, which was a way of saying the work would be private. He placed the spade in the earth, not digging yet, and surveyed the ground as if reading a field of script. "They were pushed here in haste," he offered. "They were not meant to be found." Matthias felt the ledger beneath his heart as an accusation. He opened his mouth. Words were dry and small. "These are the dates," he said. "Some match the ledger precisely. Ryan's jaw worked names also," he asked. He was careful, spare with the question as though the vocalized possibility could make the world tip. Matthias nodded. He could not bring himself to show the pages in that open place. The ledger imagined itself already exonerated or condemned. It had been his private terror. Yet the chief thing that had changed in him since the ledger's discovery was that the names had begun to carry faces in his head, faces arranged by rumor and Edda's annotated folios. Faces that had names he had never spoken aloud. They began at the edge of the hollow. Ryan selected a mound by eye and set to work, the spade swinging with careful economy. The clay was damp, the soil smelling of iron and old smoke. Matthias found his knees bending before he meant to, and he stayed there, hands folded in his lap, not touching, a hill of paper man in a place of living dirt. He could feel each spadeful as testimony. The first marker was splintered, the carved letters gone. Ryan scraped at the moss with a fingernail and found a short line of painted script. His fingers were steady. He breathed a name, Joran Veld. It left his mouth like something, then set itself down. Matthias counted it against the ledger. The date matched. The payment line matched. A salt washed over him, less an explanation, more the sudden impossible knowledge that the ledger's elegances had been lived and not merely written. Ryan set his hand to the earth and spoke low. They did not have the luxury of a wake. An old man sat watching from the shadow of a shrub. Old Watchman Bird had come up from the path, his coat mended and his hands folded like prayer. He had been a soldier once, Matthias knew, a string of small stories told in the tavern that hung to his name like a scent. Bird shuffled forward on a cane and placed a rough palm on the shoulder of the mound, as if to hold it for the person who would come home later and find it. They were brought here in the dark, Bird said. At night the men with the cords lifted them. We heard horses. A woman screamed once. Not many heard. His voice was not loud, but it made the leaves quiet. Matthias wanted to ask how the watchman remembered such detail, but the man seemed less a source of fact than a channel for the hollow's memory. Bird's eyes shone indignantly at the thought that anyone could have thought a life was nothing. They were left to rot like broken tools, he said. Not even a marker that would stand the weather. That's not honor. Not the way we did it when I was near the walls. Ryan removed a small cloth from his pack and draped it over the broken headwood. Put a name where there can be a name, he said. He moved swiftly, as if haste were a counter to ritual, and cleared the ground with efficient strokes. Matthias watched him find the hollow under the board, where a few tokens had been placed, the little private objects that people left as though a talisman could slow the rot. A scrap of coarse cloth, a child's wooden bead, a corroded button. At the base of the mound, under a line of rotted root, Ryan's fingers found something dense and cold. He turned it over and brushed the clotted soil away. It was a small leather pouch, worn at the seam. He opened it with a motion that sent a soft puff of earth into the air. Matthias could not see well at first. The pouch contained a flat disc of lead stamped with a crude crest. His breath left him in a small, dry sound. The impression on the lead was a shield with a tiny glyph he knew as well as his own handwriting, an old family mark he had seen in the margins of a tax register and on a school exercise his grandfather had kept. He had not seen it on any public seal for decades. His fingers ached at the sight. Ryan's jaw clamped. He looked up with eyes that had the weathered hardness of a man who had placed masks on himself for long service. This came with them, Ryan said, as if reading from a record of bones. Small things, papers, coin a seal. They'd been forced to hand them over to be kept. It wasn't always the sword alone. Sometimes it was paper and promise. Matthias felt his face hollow. The ledger under his cloak was suddenly less an abstract ledger and more a map with names linked by threads to objects in the soil. The line etched on the lead, faint though it was, wore the same curl that had appeared in the margins of his father's neat hand. 1,000 small, tidy gestures of survival sealing letters. Signing without seeing the words had allowed those bodies to be collected and the city to be rebuilt on top of their absence. Your family mark, Ryan said, not a question but a fact that lodged like a stone. Matthias' hands closed involuntarily over the ledger at his chest. It could be a common motive, he said, the scholarly formulation of evasion. For a moment Ryan did not speak. Then he straightened, the movement abrupt as a decision. "It could," he repeated. "But we do not have the luxury of probabilities when we are sitting above graves." There was no melodrama in Ryan's voice. It was the voice that had once given orders in the open and now gave one to the soil. "Look." Matthias knelt. The earth was cool at his palms, the texture of it an old, honest thing that did not yield to the carefulness in his ink-stained fingers. He slid his hand under the broken leaflet of wood and lifted. A slit of darkness answered him, and then his fingers touched cloth, the brittleness of woven wool preserved by damp. He drew out a strip of fabric and a small, brittle scrap of paper wrapped within it. The paper was frayed but not obliterated. There was a handwriting on it that he recognized at once. A minute. Practiced hand with a tiny flourish on the same curve his grandfather had used in the margins of account books. For a long time Matthias held the scrap and hardly knew what to do with it. The rational part of him catalogued possibilities. Perhaps the mark had been pilfered or planted. Perhaps the same crest had been used by other families. Perhaps further evidence would clear it. But matter does not wait on logic. The lead disc was warm from the rubbing of fingers. The scrap smelled of age and smoke, and the stitchwork of the pouch suggested a maker who knew how to hold something precious against damp. These were not arguments, only the eloquence of things. Ryan watched him as if watching a confession. "They called them names when they buried them," the captain said suddenly. "In the dark, without fanfare. A whisper so the men in the wagons would know who was left. We were assigned to watch so the cry didn't wake the city, so the city could forget faster. I never spoke the names aloud afterwards. I couldn't. But I remembered faces." Matthias felt a tightness like a cord pulled around his ribs. Faces were now what the ledger had become. He thought of the scriptorium's polishing of official records, the way small, unflattering lines were sanded out so the chronicle would shine when placed on the Empress' altar. He thought of the ledger, neatly bound and misfiled, a thing that had been entrusted to his hands because his family had known how to hide. He felt the ledger's spine pressed to his chest as if it had weight beyond paper, carrying the lives of those whose bodies lay in a hollow. Was there a child among them? Matthias asked, because the ledger had a notation that had always taken his eye, a name followed by a small mark that an archivist would note as infant or dependent. Ryan's face collapsed in an old softness. "There were two," he said. "A boy who clutched a scrap of blue cloth. The cloth is worse to remember than the face. It was worn thin like a memory. And a girl who had a piece of thread twisted in her hair. They had no place to lay them where any of their kin would come and see. We left them here because no one else would." Matthias pressed his palm to a mound nearby where grass had not quite knit into place. "The ledger shows payments," he said, voice low. "To men who took names and turned them over. It lists sums and dates. They were counted as liabilities, not people." Ryan spat a little in the mud, a small private act. "I saw the men with ledgers. They wrote with their sleeves clean. They counted as if the things they were counting were numbers and not what they were," he said. "They did not look when they turned away. They never looked." There was a kind of rage that moved quietly through Ryan's speech, a controlled, bitter thing. Matthias felt ashamed to be the man who had learned to tidy lines and erase. He knew how to make a ledger sing a kind of tune. He also knew the names of the men who had sharpened erasure into ritual. He had been taught that a smooth chronicle would save lives by preserving stability. Had stability been worth this? The question hung between the trees like rain. They worked with a new, solemn patience after that. Ryan uncovered another marker and read a name. Matthias leaned close and traced the name with a finger, as though the flesh of the letters might speak. Each name detached from the ledger and took on weight. He murmured them quietly, each one an admission he had not allowed himself until now. Jorenveld, Lissa Marin, Talok Dunn. Saying the names was a small sacrament. It made something inside him shift. After the third grave, Ryan stood and stretched, as if to dislodge something deep in his back. "You should see them with me," he said at last, not accusing but informing. "You should know what the ledger looks like in the dirt. If you are going to carry that book, you should know how it sits in a grave." Matthias felt as if his choices had narrowed to a lane as thin as a blade. The city would never willingly give up its clean origin story. The Chancellor's bureaucracy would call the ledger an error, a misfiling, a criminal forgery 1,000 times over, and the Empress would be advised to smooth things so that the Empire's foundations would not tremble. Yet here, amid the mounds, the ledger was a bridgehead of shame that could not be walked past. As they turned at last toward the path home, Bird lingered by one mound and produced from his breast a small toy of carved wood, ragged and chewed. "Someone left this," he muttered. "A child clung to it while they were taken. I kept it because it shouldn't be buried with strangers. There's no justice if we leave things to rot." Ryan accepted the toy from him with emotion that was more courtesy than sentiment. He tucked it into his cloak as if to keep it warm. The city was visible then over the lip of the hill, chimneys, the new stone ring of the palace, banners that were only ever unrolled to remind people of the story they must tell. The sight of it had always pleased Matthias in a measured way. He admired the order of the capital, the way the new streets fit each other like well-cut pages. Now the view felt like a skin stretched taut over something rotten. They walked back in a slow, companionable silence that was heavier than any argument. Ryan's shoulders were set. Bird moved like a man who had been given a purpose, thin and fierce. Matthias kept the ledger close and did not open it. He had seen enough to understand that the act of matching name to bone had changed his relationship to what he had first treated as text. He carried the sack of his household's linen and the small scrap with the family mark and felt as if he carried a verdict and not a curiosity. That night at his small table, the candle guttering against the windows dark, Matthias spread the linen and examined the scrap again. The graphite of the ledger's marginalia glinted faintly Edda's hand, the convent's handwriting, the faint rubrics of Sister Arnwin's ink voices that had helped him build a case in whiteness and secrecy. He laid the lead disc on the open ledger and watched as two worlds sat side by side, one of official calculation and one of object and clay and dirt. The disc should have been an incidental thing. The sight of it on the ledger made it monstrous. He could not sleep. The small token, once a curiosity, was now an accusation. He thought of his mother at the hearth, of his cousin's timid smile at Sunday meals, of neighbors that had nodded to his family as if the Corvins were respectable because they kept their heads down. He thought of the offer that had smelled of law and mercy, the bribe to sign a formal redaction that would absolve names and secure a promotion. How much of that forgiveness had been purchased on the backs of these bodies? The ledger's neat figures had warmed a room where the Corvins kept a small comfort. The token in the dirt, the child with the blue cloth, the bare mounds with no fanfare, these things entered his sleep as if to demand recompense. In the grey before dawn he rose and wrapped the lead discs in an old scrap of cloth and placed it in the inner pocket of his waistcoat as if it were a prayer. He sat then and wrote while his hand trembled with cold and resolve, making a small list of names. He numbered them and penciled beside each one a parallel in the ledger. He made a second list of the men who appeared on the ledger as recipients' names he had seen faintly in the columned register. To write them was to bind them. At the edge of his list, with a sharp certainty that surprised him by its clarity, Matthias wrote a single line: "If these are the people who made our peace, then I will not let their names be erased without a record." The sentence surprised him with its bluntness. It was not yet a plan. It was the first, small, honest movement of a conscience that had been habituated to omission, but now realized the cost of that habit. Outside his window the city began to wake, bell and cart and dog. The rebuilt capital would go about its public business unaware of the hollow behind the U. The chronicle would be brushed and prepared. The chancellor's men would walk their corridors and polish their robes, and remind themselves of why some things were kept from sight. Matthias folded his lists and tucked the ledger into a box beneath his bed. He did not know yet whether the next steps would be confession, concealment, or some cunning compromise. He only knew the lead disc near his heart and the faces that would come to him whenever he tried to sleep. Guilt had become more than an inner weight. It had the pressure of a stone object, a thing that could be shown, examined, and judged. When he closed his eyes, he heard Ryan's voice saying the names softly, as if by naming them he could make amends. He thought of the hollow mounds and the toy that Bird had kept. And then a darker thought formed, steady and sudden. If the token could be traced to his family, what else might be out there under someone else's hand? What other objects tied ledger to flesh? The question pressed against his ribs like a cue. There would be no gentle end. The ledger had opened a door into the truth, and beyond it lay rooms of consequence. Matthias did not yet know whether he would step through the threshold. He only knew that stepping back would mean letting the city sleep on soil made of other people's losses. He lay awake and felt the weight of that choice settle, a physical thing as real as the disc in his pocket. Outside, the day thickened. Somewhere in the city, a clerk sang a small, precise voice appropriate to the work of smoothing history. The chronicle would be polished. The Empress ritual would be rehearsed. And in a little room under the eaves, a scribe who had learned to tidy sentences felt the ledger's teeth under his hands and realized that names had begun to gather like gravestones on the margin of his conscience. He thought of one last thing before sleep finally took him, Ryan's quietness when he read the name aloud. It had no triumph. It had the hollow, steady cadence of a man trying to keep faith with the dead. If Matthias were to act, he would have to choose whether to remain part of the machinery that kept such graves out of sight, or to let the names travel from margin to mouth and from mouth to market, and, perhaps, to the conscience of the city itself. The ledger under his bed was not a book now, but a decision waiting with the patient cruelty of a thing you could not unmake. The disc pressed into the cloth at his side, and then, inexplicably, he heard the scrape of a spade in the wet, and Ryan's voice calling out another name that very quietly might be his own. The thought of that name hanging in the air stopped his breath, and left the night stocked with an impossible, answering tremor. When dawn finally came, it would bring with it a choice. The chronicle would be sanctified in fewer days. The ledger's names would either stay in the margins or cross into the daylight and make the city look up. Matthias did not yet know what he would do. He only knew that the graves had turned his ledger into accusation, and that silence had become, in itself, an act. He blew out the candle and, in the dark, felt the lead disc like a small, obstinate heart against his breastbone. The hook of consequence had been set. The next move would be his, and whatever he chose would not leave the world as it had been. Matthias came to the scriptorium with habits that were small and precise as prayer. He folded the corner of a new sheet to judge the thickness by touch, tested a nib in the margin to feel the ink's provenance, set his ruler at a breath's distance from the edge, so letters would breathe instead of crowding. Those gestures had been taught to him by Galen, by the other men and women who had inked themselves into the palace's life for decades. The world made sense when lines were kept straight and mistakes were smudged away with patient, practiced hands. The chronicle required clean surfaces, and the work of cleaning could be sanctified into virtue. Matthias's fingers knew this ritual as intimately as the letters they traced. On the morning the doors closed, the air had a thinness to it, as if the city itself had been folded and ironed. Light fell through the clerestory and landed on the rows of tables like an assessment. There was so much to be kept in order. The scriptorium smelled of vellum and warm glue, of cold wax, and the oil of lamps, and of a faint, persistent tang of ash that clung like memory to certain pages. It had been a year of strict discipline and slow rewrites. Even now, as summer unstitched itself into heat, the place offered a kind of shelter. Matthias believed in the shelter because he lived there. Shelter was not an argument but an accumulated habit. He did not notice the first man until the man's shadow crossed his workbench. The man was not a scribe. He wore the kind of coat that did not crease with work and a collar cut to look like a statement rather than a tool. The paper in Matthias's hands snapped with his sudden start. The nib left a tiny blot that he smoothed with the heel of his other hand, as though nothing had happened. The stranger's voice was clipped and practiced. "Good morning, master of the scriptorium." There was no greeting in it, only the arrangement of letters designed to solicit the right kind of compliance. Galen looked up slowly. Matthias watched the old man, the steadier fixture of their life, recognize the sound of an authority calibrated to take from him something more than time. Galen's eyes, which usually exhaled patience, narrowed, and then he rose with the manner of someone who had more rituals than most. He draped his robe about his shoulders the way a man adjusts a habit that has performed him. Even that modest motion trembled plastically, like a bell struck not for joy. "We have business with the records," the man said. "An inquiry from the Chancellor's office." Galen's voice had the flatness of someone reading an old script aloud. "State business is to be conducted by appointment." The man produced a parchment and unfolded it with hands that betrayed no tremor. The seal that fell open was not the Chancellor's personal wax, but a lesser emblem, an office's imprimatur, a bureaucracy's teeth. Outside, the city would call it a formality. Inside, in the rooms where ink set memory, it read like a summons with muscle behind it. They moved through the ranks of tables with an economy that did not waste smiles or attention. The other scribes looked up and then went back to their measures. There is a kind of survival in pretending there is nothing to see. Matthias's face warmed. He felt the old reflex to put work before worry, to let the office manage the office. But when the man's eyes lingered and fell on his chest, as if measuring the young scribe for a ledger of his own, there was in that look something like the accounting of a future, where one might have to give account of the past. They requested a list of copies. They asked for indices and inventories. Their parchments were neat and their questions more surgical than blunt. They did not tear down shelves with torches and uproar. They performed civility as the habitation of power. Galen obliged with the old calm. He led them down the aisles between stacks like a man guiding visitors through the bones of a city. His hand rested, unthinkingly, on the spines of books as he passed them, as if to comfort them or to make them known. Matthias followed, keeping his distance like someone trailing scent. He could not help noticing the way the men catalogued Galen's face as much as they did the manuscript covers, a line nicked at the temple. A spot of ink that would not scrub away, the particular way the master carried his elbow. Such details are the currency of people who read people the way scribes read scripts. They led Galen away with the courtesy of strong hands. No one thought to shout, to plead, to wrap themselves around the old man's knees. The scriptorium's culture had trained a different response. Galen had been summoned to the Chancellor's office. He would be questioned for a matter of state. He went through the door not like a man being stolen, but like someone walking into a long-anticipated council. The men's coats crossed behind him as if fastening a cloak on a statue. Hours later he returned, as promised. He did not look like the man who had left. There is a kind of diminution that cannot be hidden by the best robe. The face is hollowed at the eyes. The gait is truncated as if a step's length had been measured out and then shorted. Galen moved among the desks like a ghost learning how to inhabit a body it had no longer practiced. For a moment, one heavy, private instant, Matthias saw Galen's hands as if through glass. They trembled when a page required turning. "Galen," Matthias said, "because politeness is a kind of lifebelt." The master turned to him and smiled, a diminution of a smile, the sort that keeps the name of kindness, but no longer supplies the warmth. There were questions about indices, he said, and the words had the